Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Chris, and today we're delving into Chapter 4 of F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. At the end of Chapter 1, Gatsby was a shadowy figure standing at the end of the dock with his hand outstretched, smashing that like button. In Chapter 2, Gatsby's wealth is a source of gossip. People claimed he was related to Kaiser Wilhelm, who was the last emperor of Germany. And as we reviewed in our last video, in Chapter 3, Gatsby was a smile. We've barely seen Gatsby. He's engaged in very little conversation with Nick. However, he did have that hour-long conversation with Jordan Baker, but we were not privy to that conversation because it took place behind closed doors. Now, Chapter 4 begins with another rumor. Gatsby is a bootlegger. A bootlegger is a person who illegally manufactures or sells alcohol. Nick is narrating this novel 2 years after the events happened. Amazingly, Nick has kept a scrap piece of paper on which he wrote down all of the people who attended Gatsby's parties. The list goes on for several paragraphs. Nick says, "I can still read the gray names, and they will give you a better impression than my generalities of those who accepted Gatsby's hospitality and paid him the subtle tribute of knowing nothing whatever about him." No one knows anything about Gatsby. Gatsby is just a word. There's no substance behind that name. There's no substance behind that man. He's known for throwing lavish parties, and that's all his guests care about. Nick's list of guests not only detail the reach and popularity of Gatsby's parties, but also reveals perhaps maybe the type of people who are attending these parties. One had a fight with a bum, one went to jail, one was so drunk he got his right hand ran over, one strangled his wife, one committed suicide. These details suggest that Gatsby is not hanging out with the most refined, polite crowd. In Chapter 4, one July morning, Gatsby comes to Nick's cottage for the first time. Gatsby says, "Good morning, old sport. You're having lunch with me today, and I thought we'd ride up together." I've always found Nick's ready acceptance of Gatsby's invitation to be interesting because this moment mirrors Tom's invitation in Chapter 2. In Chapter 2, Nick said, "The supercilious assumption was that on Sunday afternoon, I had nothing better to do." While Nick expresses some displeasure about Tom's invitation in Chapter 2, here in Chapter 4, Nick expresses no reservation whatsoever when Gatsby shows up unannounced one random morning and invites him to lunch. During this scene, Gatsby is described as being really fidgety, like something is forcing him to constantly move. He's never at ease. Nick begins to admire Gatsby's car, and Nick narrates, "I had seen it. Everybody had seen it. It was a rich cream color, bright with nickel, swollen here and there in its monstrous length, with triumphant hat boxes and supper boxes and toolboxes, and terraced with a labyrinth of windshields that mirrored a dozen suns. Sitting down behind many layers of glass, in a sort of green leather conservatory, we started to town." Gatsby is new money. He's a person who's acquired a considerable fortune in his own lifetime. Another characteristic of new money people is that they are very showy with their wealth. They're very ostentatious. Their cars are a public declaration of their bank statement. If they're rich, they want everyone to know it, and a car is a way to advertise their wealth. As Gatsby and Nick start to drive, Nick reflects, "I had talked with him perhaps 6 times in the past month, and found, to my disappointment, that he had little to say. So my first impression that he was a person of some undefined consequence had gradually faded, and he had become simply the proprietor of an elaborate roadhouse next door." There is no substance to Gatsby. He has nothing to say. He is of no consequence. He's known for throwing rowdy parties, and that's it. This car ride gets really awkward really quickly because Gatsby abruptly says, "Look here, old sport, what's your opinion of me anyhow?" Nick is overwhelmed by this question, and understandably so, because it is a minefield. How do you respond to that? How do you respond to an acquaintance, someone you're not that familiar with, asking this really probing question? Before Nick can respond, Gatsby continues, "I'll tell you God's truth. I am the son of some wealthy people in the Middle West, all dead now. I was brought up in America, but educated at Oxford, because all my ancestors have been educated there for many years. It is a family tradition. I don't know about you, but when someone starts with, "I'll tell you God's truth," red flags go up in my mind. Something's not quite right. Someone's trying too hard. Nick notices that Gatsby said the part about Oxford really quickly. This observation causes Nick to remember that moment in chapter 3 when Jordan Baker said she doesn't believe that Gatsby attended Oxford. So Nick decides to probe a little bit and ask a follow-up question about Gatsby's story. Liars sometimes have difficulty providing extra details or recalling those extra details again when you ask about them later. Who knows, if Nick was alive today, maybe he could get a job with the FBI as a profiler. Nick casually inquires, "What part of the Middle West?" Gatsby says, "San Francisco. My family all died and I came into a good deal of money." After his family's death, Gatsby gallivanted through Europe until World War I broke out. During the war, Gatsby served as a first lieutenant and he received a medal for extraordinary valor. He conveniently pulls this medal out of his pocket and shows it to Nick. Then, immediately after that, he also pulls out a photograph of him at Oxford. Okay, let's recap for a moment. Gatsby is from a wealthy family, all dead now. He attended an elite university. He's a decorated war hero, and confronted with this medal and this photograph, Nick declares, then it was all true. Nick buys it, hook, line, and sinker. Without pausing, Gatsby proceeds to say, "I'm going to make a big request of you today. So I thought you ought to know something about me. I didn't want you to think I was just some nobody. You see, I usually find myself among strangers because I drift here and there, trying to forget the sad thing that happened to me. You'll hear about it this afternoon." Gatsby doesn't want Nick to think he's a nobody. And that word nobody reminds me of all of the rumors that Nick has heard about Gatsby. Maybe Gatsby is aware that people gossip about him, and he's trying to change Nick's perception of him. This also brings up the issue of, what is the purpose of today? Is it simply two friends hanging out, going and getting lunch? At first it may all seem very random, but Gatsby's actions are very calculated. And the reason why he's telling Nick all of this biographical information completely unsolicited, he doesn't want Nick to think he's a nobody. But why does he care? Why does he care so much about Nick's opinion? There must be a deeper reason. And we, the readers, do know that Nick was thinking Gatsby was a nobody, just someone who hosted these rowdy parties. That part about the sad thing that happened to Gatsby, that is foreshadowing something that will happen later in the chapter. Okay, let's continue. Gatsby reveals that he has arranged Jordan Baker to have tea with Nick later this afternoon. And at this tea, Jordan will talk about the sad thing that has happened to Gatsby. I find it hilarious how Gatsby is acting like Nick's social director. Right now, they're on the way to a lunch that Gatsby has invited Nick to, and then later in the day, Gatsby has arranged for Nick to have tea with Jordan Baker. At this time, Nick starts to become a little annoyed with Gatsby, kind of reminiscent of Nick's attitude towards Tom in chapter 2. But two things change Nick's mind. The first is, as a traffic cop starts to pull over Gatsby, Gatsby takes a white card from his wallet and flashes it towards the cop. The cop then says, "Right you are. Know you next time, Mr. Gatsby. Excuse me." We can infer that Gatsby has some connections to some very powerful people, because I wish I could get out of a traffic ticket that easily. There is a second thing that helps melt away Nick's annoyance. Nick narrates, "Over the great bridge, with the sunlight through the girders, making a constant flicker upon the moving cars, with the city rising up across the river in white heaps and sugar lumps, all built with a wish out of non-olfactory money. The city scene from the Queensboro Bridge is always the city scene for the first time, in its first wild promise of all of the mystery and the beauty in the world." A bridge allows a connection. It allows us to overcome and traverse obstacles. Even the bridge itself is great. It's literally an engineering marvel. As Gatsby and Nick cross the bridge, Nick is looking into the horizon and the skyscrapers are going to be rising up, reaching greater and greater heights. That word rising conjures up associations of growth, advancement, and progress. Fitzgerald describes the skyscrapers in kind of a funny, poetic way. Nick describes the skyscrapers as a bunch of little sugar cubes stacked on top of one another. What has caused this city New York City to exist. A wish has compelled the city into existence. Humans compelled the city into existence. Through invention, hard work, business, cooperation, humankind has created New York City. And this wish was created out of non-olfactory money. Olfactory means related to smell, so this is kind of saying non-smelly money created New York City, or another way to think about that is uncorrupt money. Man's clean efforts, pure intent is what led to the marvel of New York City. New York City offers a promise. As the famous expression goes, if you can make it in New York City, you can make it anywhere. People go to New York City to prove themselves, to reinvent themselves. New York contains mystery and beauty. New York is home to Wall Street, Broadway, business headquarters, museums. It is the financial, economic, and cultural capital of the United States. Even Nick himself moved to New York City to become a successful bondsman. He wants to reinvent himself and break away from his family and be an independent man. In this moment, crossing the bridge, Nick feels this immense sense of optimism. Like New York City is the beginning of the world. It's a place that he can create a new life. This passage also connects to Fitzgerald's life. That expression, rising up, that word up appears more than 200 times in the book. And Fitzgerald claims, I don't know exactly how he knows this, but Fitzgerald claimed that the first word he ever spoke was up. Throughout his life, Fitzgerald had an inferiority complex where he really wanted to be accepted by people from higher social classes. He felt insecure about his status and level of wealth. There's a famous story that when Fitzgerald was young, he was dating this rich girl, and one weekend he went to the girl's house, and Fitzgerald overheard the father say, "Rich girls don't marry poor boys." Then, years later, Fitzgerald fell in love with a woman named Zelda, and Zelda was from a very prominent family in Alabama. To gain approval from Zelda's father, Fitzgerald decided to go to New York City and to break into the publishing world. Reminiscent of Nick here moving to New York City to become a successful bondsman. However, Fitzgerald did not last very long in New York City. He failed and he retreated to Minnesota to live with his parents. Nick continues to narrate the bridge passage. A dead man passed us in a hearse heaped with blooms, followed by 2 carriages with drawn blinds, and by more cheerful carriages for friends. The friends looked out at us with the tragic eyes and short upper lips of southeastern Europe, and I was glad that the sight of Gatsby's splendid car was included in their somber holiday. As we crossed Blackwell's Island, a limousine passed us, driven by a white chauffeur, in which sat 3 modish Negroes, 2 bucks and a girl. I laughed aloud as the yolks of their eyeballs rolled towards us in haughty rivalry. Anything can happen now that we've slid over this bridge. Anything at all. Even Gatsby could happen without any particular wonder. Notice Nick mentions 2 cars. The hearse is associated with a funeral. The deceased family seems like they are immigrants from southeastern Europe. This hearse represents the death of Europe. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, millions of immigrants came from Europe to America seeking economic opportunities. Then, after that wave of immigration, World War I destroyed Europe. America, relatively unaffected by the war, emerged as a more prominent player on the world stage. Now, the second car in this passage is a limousine, and it's being driven by a white chauffeur, and the passengers are African Americans. While Europe may be dying, in America, a group that had historically experienced discrimination can now advance economically. This passage connects to the idea of the American dream. The American dream is the notion that it doesn't matter which family you're born to or who your social connections are. If you have talent, if you work hard, you will be rewarded for your accomplishments. You can advance through society based on your merit, not on your social background. The bridge, the skyscrapers, the other cars, all of this causes Nick to feel this optimism, like anything can happen in New York City. Nick concludes this passage by thinking, if something as unprecedented and marvelous as New York City can exist, then is it so strange that someone as unprecedented and marvelous as Gatsby exists? A man who lives alone in a mansion and hosts parties for strangers. Is it really so strange that that exists? Anything can happen. Once in Manhattan, Gatsby and Nick enjoyed their private lunch. Except no, that's not what happened. It turns out Gatsby invited another friend to the lunch, and this friend is Meyer Wolfsheim. Now, unfortunately, Fitzgerald used Wolfsheim's physical description and accent to create a Jewish caricature. During this meal, Gatsby excuses himself. While Gatsby is away, Wolfsheim proceeds to say a lot of glowing things about Gatsby. He calls Gatsby a gentleman, an Oxford man, a man of fine breeding, a man that you would take home and introduce to your mother and sister. Wolfsheim also says Gatsby's very careful about women. He would never so much look at a friend's wife. Then Gatsby returns to the table and Wolfsheim excuses himself and says goodbye. What just happened? Why did Gatsby invite this random guy to lunch? It seems like Gatsby wanted a character witness, someone to corroborate all of the things that Gatsby told Nick earlier in the chapter. This is yet more evidence of Gatsby's plotting ways. But just who is this character witness, Meyer Wolfsheim? Wolfsheim tells a story about the old Metropole, which sounds like a bar or restaurant that he used to hang out with his friends. One night, and someone from outside wants to speak to Rosie. So at 4 o'clock in the morning, Rosie gets up and goes outside and is shot dead. If you've ever seen movies like The Godfather or Goodfellas, anything to do with the Mafia, this scene is really reminiscent of those movies. We can infer that Wolfsheim is probably involved in organized crime. Gatsby also mentions that Meyer Wolfsheim was responsible for fixing the World Series in 1919. To fix a sporting event means you force one side to lose so that gamblers can profit. Nick is also admiring Wolfsheim's cuff buttons, which are made of human molars. Maybe those human molars came from one of Wolfsheim's enemies? At one point, Wolfsheim also says to Nick, "I understand you're looking for a business connection." And Gatsby quickly intervenes, "Oh no, this isn't the man." It seems like Gatsby may be involved in two different worlds, and he doesn't want to invite Nick into this world. He wants to keep Nick separate from Wolfsheim and Wolfsheim's crowd. Notice how this contrasts with Nick's observation that New York City was built out of uncorrupt money. Wolfsheim's background and Gatsby's avoidance of a traffic ticket all suggest that corruption is alive and well in New York City. And that's why I love this book. There are so many contradictions for us to unpack and to analyze and to think about what Fitzgerald is really trying to say. As Gatsby and Nick are leaving the restaurant, Nick sees Tom. He goes over, says hi to Tom, introduces Gatsby to Tom, and Gatsby seems a little embarrassed. Nick is talking to Tom. He turns around to include Gatsby in the conversation, and Gatsby has disappeared. Fitzgerald briefly changes the narrator here. Jordan Baker is now the narrator, and we're reading what she tells Nick later that day when the two have tea together. We flash back 5 years prior to October of 1917. Daisy is 18 years old and she lives in one of the largest houses in all of Louisville. Jordan is 2 years younger than Daisy and admires Daisy. Jordan is walking down the street one day and she sees Daisy sitting in a car with a young lieutenant. Jordan has never forgotten this moment because she says, "The officer looked at Daisy while she was speaking in a way that every young girl wants to be looked at sometime." It turns out the young officer is J. Gatsby. That winter, Daisy tried to go to New York City to say goodbye to Gatsby before he deployed to Europe, but Daisy's mother prevented her from going, and Daisy was very distraught. By the autumn of 1918, Daisy is happy again. In February of 1919, Daisy is presumed to be engaged to a man from New Orleans. But in June of 1919, Daisy marries Tom Buchanan of Chicago. Tom came down to Louisville with 100 people in 4 private cars and rented out the entire floor of a hotel. He also gave Daisy a necklace of pearls valued at $350,000. Now, I don't know how much that pearl necklace would be worth today, but that sounds really expensive. I mean, $350,000 is expensive today. So I imagine it was a lot of money back then as well. And also, that's not even the wedding ring. It's just a pearl necklace. How much is the wedding ring worth? So that detail about Daisy presumably marrying someone from New Orleans, but then quite abruptly marrying Tom Buchanan, it seems like maybe Tom's wealth had something to do with that. Jordan talks about how the night before the wedding, she goes into Daisy's hotel room and Daisy is wasted. Daisy is incoherently mumbling, "Tell them Daisy's changed her mind. Daisy's changed her mind." And she cries and cries and cries. So Jordan and a maid take Daisy, drop her in a cold bath to try and sober her up. And the entire time Daisy's in this bath, she's clutching a letter that she doesn't let anyone read. We can infer the letter Daisy is clutching is from Gatsby. And Daisy still has feelings for Gatsby. But she understands that Tom can provide her financial security. So the next day at 5 o'clock, she marries Tom Buchanan. So Daisy does decide to marry Tom, but then it's as if she has to convince herself that she actually loves Tom. Jordan shares this observation of Daisy and Tom after their wedding. "I saw them in Santa Barbara when they came back, and I thought I'd never seen a girl so mad about her husband. If he left the room for a minute, she'd look around uneasily and say, 'Where's Tom gone?' and wear the most abstracted expression until she saw him coming in the door." While Daisy is showing concern and affection for Tom, what is Tom doing? Jordan narrates, "A week after I left Santa Barbara, Tom ran into a wagon on the Ventura Road one night and ripped a front wheel off his car. The girl who was with him got into the papers too, because her arm was broken. She was one of the chambermaids in the Santa Barbara hotel." Remember in chapter 1 how Daisy tells Nick about the birth of her daughter and how Tom was absent and we could infer that Tom was cheating on Daisy? Well, apparently that cheating started shortly after their marriage. Tom was in a car accident and his passenger was a female that was not Daisy. The passenger was an employee of the Santa Barbara hotel. The innuendo here is that Tom was cheating with the girl from the hotel. And this story is in the newspaper. People can read between the lines and understand the truth, and it becomes a public scandal, and Daisy is embarrassed. It's one thing to be betrayed in private, but for that to be public information adds a whole nother layer of humiliation. Jordan finishes her story and Nick is now the narrator again. And Nick has not put all of the pieces together yet. Nick thinks it's a mighty big coincidence that Gatsby bought a mansion so close to Daisy's mansion. And Jordan reveals Gatsby bought that house so Daisy would be just across the bay. This revelation causes Nick to reflect. Then it had not been merely the stars to which he had aspired on that June night. He came alive to me, delivered suddenly from the womb of his purposeless splendor. Nick's reflection here is a contrast of his opinion earlier in the chapter, when he said that Gatsby was just a man of undefined consequence who threw rowdy parties. Now, Nick understands there's a deeper substance to the man Gatsby. Jordan continues, "He wants to know if you'll invite Daisy to your house some afternoon and then let him come over." But why does it have to be Nick's house in the first place? Like, why couldn't Jordan host this reunion? Nick has the same question, and Jordan responds, he wants her to see his house, and your house is right next door. We now see the extent of Gatsby's plan. To win back the woman of his dreams, Gatsby bought a mansion directly across the bay from her. He threw these lavish parties hoping that one night she would just drift in. But when that failed, he he befriended her distant cousin and recruited her childhood friend to ask her distant cousin to host a reunion for him and her. At the end of chapter 4, Nick and Jordan are driving in a car, and Nick narrates, "We passed a barrier of dark trees, and then the facade of 59th Street. A block of delicate pale light beamed down into the park. Unlike Gatsby and Tom Buchanan, I had no girl whose disembodied face floated along the dark cornices and blinding signs. And so I drew up the girl beside me, tightening my arms. Her wan, scornful mouth smiled. And so I drew her up again closer, this time to my face." Nick is kissing Jordan, but I always find this part interesting because Nick describes Jordan's mouth as scornful. Scornful means full of disgust and hatred. So Nick says her mouth is scornful, but then he kisses her anyway. As I mentioned in a previous video, it seems like Nick is attracted to unobtainable objects. Jordan has a higher social status than Nick, so Nick is trying to pursue Jordan to prove that he can have her. Nick is also humble, bragging that he actually gets to kiss the girl, while Gatsby and Tom dream of disembodied faces. So on the cover, we talked about in a previous video how it seems like there is an amusement park, and it does mention that again towards the end of chapter 4 here. It talks about how Gatsby hosted these parties and dispensed light to try and attract Daisy, trying to attract her like a moth. But of course that plan failed. So here the new detail about the cover is this disembodied face. That is Daisy. It's Daisy haunting Gatsby's dreams. He can't have the woman. He can't hold her. He can't hug her. He can't cuddle her. She's just this face in his dreams, in his mind. And then it's the same thing with Tom. It seems like Tom's disembodied face, I guess, would be Myrtle or any of the other women that he's had all of these affairs with. He is not loyal to Daisy. Daisy is not his one true love. And so Tom is filled with several disembodied faces floating around, and he desires them and wants them. I hope this helped clarify chapter 4. If you're still confused about anything, let me know in the comments and I'll try to help you out. In the next video, we will cover chapter 5, in which there is a monumental reunion.